Welcome to this unit on utility theory, one of the most fundamental concepts in microeconomics and consumer behavior. In the previous units, we studied demand, supply, and market equilibrium, which explained how prices are determined in the market. In this unit, we move our attention from the market to the consumer and try to understand an important question. Why do consumers buy goods and services? The simple answer is that consumers purchase goods because these goods provide them with satisfaction or want satisfaction. In economics, this satisfaction is known as utility. Utility theory explains how consumers allocate their limited income among different goods and services to obtain maximum satisfaction. Understanding this theory is important not only for economists but also for managers because every business must understand consumer preferences before designing products, fixing prices, or developing marketing strategies. The slide introduces two important laws of utility theory. The first is the law of diminishing marginal utility, and the second is the law of equimarginal utility. These two laws together explain how consumers make rational purchasing decisions. Before studying these laws, however, we must first understand the meaning of the word marginal, which is highlighted on the slide. The term marginal refers to the effect of a small change in the consumption of a good. In economics, marginal analysis examines what happens when one additional unit of a commodity is consumed. For example, suppose a person has already consumed 2 cups of tea. If the person drinks one more cup, economists study the additional satisfaction obtained from that extra cup. Similarly, if a student buys one more notebook or a family purchases 1 additional kilogram of rice, economists analyze the effect of that additional unit. The famous economist Alfred Marshall explained this idea by stating that marginal considerations concern a slight increase or reduction in the stock of anything that we possess. Thus, marginal analysis focuses on incremental changes rather than the total quantity consumed. Now let us understand the meaning of utility itself. The slide defines utility as the satisfaction obtained from consuming various units of a commodity. It is important to note that utility does not necessarily mean usefulness in the ordinary sense. In economics, a commodity possesses utility if it satisfies a human want. For example, drinking water provides utility because it satisfies thirst. A book provides utility because it satisfies the desire for knowledge. A mobile phone provides utility because it satisfies communication needs. Even products like chocolates, perfumes, or entertainment services provide utility because they satisfy consumer wants. Thus, utility simply refers to the ability of a good or service to satisfy human wants. The slide next introduces the concept of total utility, commonly abbreviated as TU. Total utility refers to the total satisfaction obtained from consuming all units of a commodity. Suppose a person eats 1 apple and receives some satisfaction. If the same person consumes 2 apples, the total satisfaction generally becomes greater than before. Similarly, consuming 3 apples may provide even greater total satisfaction. Therefore, the slide correctly states that the more units of a commodity a consumer consumes, the greater will generally be the total utility, at least during the initial stages of consumption. However, this does not mean that satisfaction increases indefinitely. As we shall learn in the next slides, the additional satisfaction obtained from each extra unit gradually decreases, leading to the law of diminishing marginal utility. The slide also lists 3 methods of measuring utility. The first is initial utility, which refers to the satisfaction obtained from consuming the first unit of a commodity. The second is total utility, which measures the overall satisfaction from consuming several units. The third is marginal utility, which measures the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming 1 extra unit. These 3 concepts are closely related and together form the foundation of utility theory. The remainder of this unit will explain how total utility and marginal utility behave as consumption increases and how rational consumers allocate their income to maximize overall satisfaction. From a managerial perspective, utility theory has tremendous practical importance. Businesses constantly study consumer preferences before launching new products, setting prices, designing advertisements, or improving product quality. Understanding what provides greater utility enables firms to satisfy customer needs more effectively and gain a competitive advantage. Similarly, governments also use consumer behavior analysis while designing taxation policies, subsidy programs, and welfare schemes. In the previous slide, we introduced the concept of utility theory and learned that consumers purchase goods and services because they provide satisfaction. We also briefly discussed the meaning of total utility and marginal utility. In this slide, we shall study these concepts in greater detail and understand how economists measure utility. The slide begins with the concept of utility. In economics, utility refers to the satisfaction or want-satisfying power of a commodity or service. It is important to understand that utility does not necessarily mean usefulness in the ordinary sense. A product may provide utility simply because it satisfies a consumer's desire. For example, food satisfies hunger, water satisfies thirst, clothing provides comfort and protection, and a mobile phone satisfies communication needs. Even luxury products such as perfumes, jewelry, or entertainment services provide utility because they satisfy specific wants. Therefore, economists define utility as the satisfaction derived from consuming different units of a commodity. The slide next introduces the concept of total utility, commonly abbreviated as TU. Total utility refers to the sum total of satisfaction that a consumer receives from consuming all the units of a commodity. Suppose a student buys one chocolate. The satisfaction received from consuming that chocolate contributes to the student's total utility. If the student consumes a second chocolate, total utility increases because additional satisfaction is obtained. Similarly, consuming a third or fourth chocolate further increases total utility. Therefore, during the initial stages of consumption, the more units of a commodity a consumer consumes, the greater the total utility becomes. However, an important point must be remembered. Although total utility increases, it does not increase at the same rate forever. Initially, every additional unit contributes significantly to satisfaction. Gradually, however, the increase in satisfaction becomes smaller. Eventually, total utility reaches its maximum level and may even begin to decline if excessive consumption continues. This behavior will become clearer when we study the relationship between total utility and marginal utility. The slide also introduces the measurement of utility. Economists traditionally discussed three important measures. The first is initial utility. Initial utility refers to the satisfaction obtained from consuming the very first unit of a commodity. For example, imagine a person who is extremely thirsty after walking in the hot sun. The first glass of water provides tremendous satisfaction because it satisfies the most urgent need. This highest initial satisfaction is known as initial utility. The second measure is total utility, which, as we have already discussed, represents the total satisfaction obtained from consuming several units of a commodity. For example, if a consumer drinks 5 glasses of water, the combined satisfaction obtained from all 5 glasses represents total utility. The third and most important measure is marginal utility, commonly abbreviated as MU. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming one extra unit of a commodity. Suppose a person has already eaten 2 slices of pizza. If the person eats one additional slice, the extra satisfaction obtained from that third slice is called the marginal utility of the third slice. Marginal utility, therefore, measures the change in total utility resulting from consuming one more unit. These three measures are closely connected. The first unit gives initial utility. The total satisfaction from all units is total utility. The extra satisfaction from each additional unit is marginal utility. Together, these concepts help economists understand consumer behavior. Let us consider another simple example. Imagine that you purchase a new smartphone. Initially, owning the phone provides considerable satisfaction because it fulfills your communication, entertainment, and educational needs. If you purchase a second identical smartphone immediately afterwards, the additional satisfaction is much smaller because most of your needs have already been satisfied. This reduction in additional satisfaction illustrates the concept of marginal utility. Although your total utility may still increase after purchasing the second phone, the increase is much smaller than the satisfaction obtained from the first phone. This principle applies to almost every ordinary commodity. The first unit generally provides the greatest satisfaction, while each additional unit contributes progressively smaller amounts of satisfaction. From a managerial perspective, understanding these concepts is extremely valuable. Businesses try to estimate how much satisfaction consumers derive from their products. In the previous slide, we discussed the concepts of utility, initial utility, total utility, and marginal utility. We learned that total utility represents the overall satisfaction obtained from consuming a commodity, while marginal utility represents the additional satisfaction derived from consuming one extra unit. In this slide, we shall understand the relationship between total utility and marginal utility with the help of the table provided. The table contains 3 columns. The first column shows the quantity consumed, ranging from 1 unit to 7 units. The second column shows the total utility, and the third column shows the marginal utility. Let us examine the table carefully. When the consumer consumes the first unit of the commodity, the total utility is 10 units. Since this is the first unit consumed, the entire satisfaction obtained is called the initial utility, and it is also the marginal utility of the first unit. Therefore, both total utility and marginal utility are 10. Now the consumer consumes the second unit. The total utility increases from 10 to 18. What is the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming this second unit? We simply subtract the previous total utility from the new total utility. That is, 18 minus 10 equals 8. Therefore, the marginal utility of the second unit is 8. Notice that although total utility has increased, the additional satisfaction has already fallen from 10 to 8. Next, the consumer consumes the third unit. Total utility rises from 18 to 24. The additional satisfaction is therefore 24 minus 18 equals 6. Thus, the marginal utility of the third unit is 6. Again, total utility has increased, but marginal utility has declined further. Now let us look at the fourth unit. Total utility increases from 24 to 28. The additional satisfaction becomes 28 minus 24 equals 4. Therefore, the marginal utility of the fourth unit is 4. The same pattern continues for the fifth unit. Total utility rises from 28 to 30. Marginal utility is 30 minus 28 equals 2. Thus, although total utility is still increasing, the increase has become much smaller. Now we reach an important stage. When the sixth unit is consumed, the total utility remains at 30. There is no increase in total utility. Therefore, 30 minus 30 equals 0. The marginal utility of the sixth unit is 0. This point is called the point of saturation or the point of maximum satisfaction. At this stage, the consumer has completely satisfied the particular want. Consuming one more unit provides no additional satisfaction. Now let us examine the seventh unit. Interestingly, total utility falls from 30 to 28. Instead of increasing satisfaction, the additional unit actually reduces overall satisfaction. The marginal utility becomes 28 minus 30 equals minus 2. Thus, marginal utility becomes negative. What does this mean? It means that consuming one more unit has created dissatisfaction, or what economists call disutility. This situation may arise because excessive consumption causes discomfort. For example, imagine eating your favorite dessert. The first serving provides tremendous satisfaction. The second serving is enjoyable but slightly less satisfying. The third serving provides still less satisfaction. Eventually, after several servings, you feel completely satisfied. If someone forces you to eat another serving, you may experience discomfort, nausea, or even illness. Instead of increasing satisfaction, the additional serving reduces your overall happiness. This is exactly what the table demonstrates. From this table, we can identify 3 important relationships between total utility and marginal utility. The first relationship is that when marginal utility is positive, total utility increases. As long as each additional unit provides positive satisfaction, total utility continues rising. The second relationship is that when marginal utility becomes 0, total utility reaches its maximum value. This is the point of complete satisfaction. The third relationship is that when marginal utility becomes negative, total utility begins to decline. Additional consumption now reduces rather than increases satisfaction. These relationships form the foundation of the law of diminishing marginal utility, which we shall study in the upcoming slides. From a managerial perspective, understanding this relationship is extremely important. Businesses cannot expect consumers to purchase unlimited quantities of the same product. As consumers become increasingly satisfied, their willingness to purchase additional units declines. Therefore, Companies introduce new product varieties, different flavors, innovative features, attractive packaging, and improved models to maintain consumer interest and increase utility. Marketing strategies also attempt to create new wants before the existing wants become fully satisfied. In the previous slide, we studied the relationship between total utility and marginal utility through a numerical table. We observed that while total utility generally increases with consumption, the additional satisfaction obtained from each successive unit gradually declines. In this slide, we shall focus specifically on the concept of marginal utility, often abbreviated as MU, because it is one of the most important ideas in consumer behavior and forms the foundation of modern demand theory. The slide begins by mentioning that the concept of marginal utility was developed by economists while attempting to explain how prices are determined in the market. Before the development of the marginal utility concept, economists found it difficult to explain why some goods, which are essential for life, are relatively cheap, while others that are less essential are very expensive. For example, water is necessary for survival, yet it is usually inexpensive. On the other hand, diamonds are not essential for survival, yet they are often extremely costly. This puzzle became known as the paradox of value. Economists later explained that prices are influenced not by total utility, but by marginal utility, that is, the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming one more unit of a commodity. The slide defines marginal utility as the additional satisfaction gained or lost from an increase or decrease in the consumption of a good or service. In simple words, marginal utility measures how much extra satisfaction a consumer receives by consuming one additional unit of a commodity. Suppose a person has already consumed 2 cups of coffee. If the person drinks one more cup, the additional satisfaction obtained from that third cup represents its marginal utility. Similarly, if a student purchases one additional notebook or a family buys one more kilogram of rice, the extra satisfaction obtained from that additional unit is called marginal utility. Thus, marginal utility is always concerned with change, not with total satisfaction. The slide also gives examples such as a motor vehicle and a haircut. Let us understand these examples. Imagine purchasing your first motor vehicle. For most people, the first vehicle provides tremendous satisfaction. It offers mobility, convenience, independence, and saves time. The marginal utility of the first vehicle is therefore very high. Now suppose the same person purchases a second vehicle immediately afterwards. Although the second vehicle may still provide additional satisfaction, its usefulness is generally less than that of the first because the person's transportation needs have already been largely satisfied. If the person purchases a third or fourth similar vehicle, the additional satisfaction continues to decline. The same principle applies to a haircut. If a person has not had a haircut for several months, the first haircut provides considerable satisfaction because it improves appearance and comfort. However, receiving another haircut immediately afterwards provides almost no additional satisfaction. Therefore, the marginal utility of successive haircuts declines rapidly. This demonstrates that marginal utility depends upon the consumer's existing level of consumption. The more units of a commodity a consumer already possesses, the less additional satisfaction is generally obtained from one more unit. This is why marginal utility gradually declines with increased consumption. It is important to distinguish between total utility and marginal utility. Total utility measures the overall satisfaction obtained from consuming several units of a commodity. Marginal utility, however, measures only the change in total utility resulting from one additional unit. For example, if consuming 3 apples gives a total utility of 30 units, and consuming 4 apples increases total utility to 36 units, the marginal utility of the 4th apple is 6 units because total utility has increased by 6. Mathematically, economists express this relationship as marginal utility equals change in total utility divided by change in quantity consumed. When only one additional unit is consumed, marginal utility simply equals the increase in total utility. From a managerial perspective, marginal utility is extremely important because businesses cannot rely only on the total satisfaction consumers receive. Instead, they focus on the additional satisfaction generated by product improvements, new features, better packaging, enhanced quality, or after-sales services. For example, Smartphone manufacturers regularly introduce improved cameras, faster processors, larger batteries, and artificial intelligence features because they want consumers to perceive greater marginal utility from purchasing the latest model. In the previous slide, we studied the concept of marginal utility and learned that it refers to the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming one extra unit of a commodity. We also observed that the additional satisfaction received from successive units generally becomes smaller. This idea forms the basis of one of the most important laws in consumer economics, the law of diminishing marginal utility. The slide presents the formal definition of this law. It states that, as a consumer consumes more and more units of a specific commodity, the utility from each successive unit goes on diminishing. This law describes a very common pattern of human behavior. Almost every one of us experiences this phenomenon in our daily lives, whether we are eating food, watching movies, listening to music, shopping, or using electronic gadgets. The first unit of a commodity usually provides the highest level of satisfaction because it satisfies the most urgent need. As consumption continues, the intensity of that need gradually decreases. Consequently, each additional unit provides less satisfaction than the previous one. It is important to understand that the law does not say that total utility decreases immediately. Instead, it states that marginal utility decreases. In other words, the consumer continues to obtain additional satisfaction from consuming more units, but the rate at which satisfaction increases gradually declines. Eventually, marginal utility becomes zero, and if consumption continues beyond that point, marginal utility becomes negative. Let us understand this with a simple example. Imagine that you are extremely thirsty after playing a game of cricket on a hot summer afternoon. The first glass of water provides enormous satisfaction because it satisfies your immediate need for water. The second glass also provides satisfaction, but not as much as the first because your thirst has already been partially satisfied. The third glass still provides satisfaction, but even less than the second. By the fourth or fifth glass, your thirst may be completely satisfied. At this stage, another glass of water provides almost no additional satisfaction. If someone forces you to drink another glass after you are already full, you may experience discomfort instead of satisfaction. This is exactly what the law of diminishing marginal utility explains. The law is not limited to water. Consider your favorite dessert. The first piece of cake tastes delicious because your desire for it is strongest. The second piece is enjoyable but slightly less satisfying. The third piece provides still less pleasure. Eventually, you may not want any more cake at all. If you continue eating beyond this point, you may even feel uncomfortable. The same principle applies to almost every ordinary commodity. Let us consider another example involving a smartphone. Suppose you purchase your first smartphone. It provides tremendous satisfaction because it enables communication, internet access, online learning, entertainment, and many other activities. Now imagine purchasing a second identical smartphone immediately afterwards. The second phone provides some additional convenience, but clearly not the same level of satisfaction as the first one. Purchasing a third identical smartphone would provide even less additional satisfaction. Thus, the marginal utility of successive smartphones continues to decline. The slide mentions that this law describes a familiar and fundamental tendency of human behavior. Why is this considered a fundamental tendency? Because human wants are satiable individually. Although human wants as a whole are unlimited, each individual want can eventually be satisfied. Once a particular want has been satisfied, the desire for additional units naturally declines. This explains why consumers usually diversify their spending rather than purchasing unlimited quantities of the same commodity. Instead of buying 10 identical shirts, consumers purchase shirts, shoes, books, mobile phones, groceries, entertainment, and many other products. They allocate their income across different goods because the marginal utility of repeatedly consuming the same commodity declines. From a managerial perspective, this law has tremendous importance. Businesses understand that consumers eventually become satisfied with existing products. Therefore, firms continuously introduce new models, improved designs, innovative features, different flavors, attractive packaging, and upgraded technology to increase the marginal utility perceived by consumers. For example, automobile manufacturers launch updated versions every year. Smartphone companies introduce new features, and food companies offer new flavors to encourage repeat purchases. Marketing and advertising also attempt to create fresh wants so that consumers continue purchasing products. In the previous slide, we studied the law of diminishing marginal utility and learned that as a consumer consumes more and more units of the same commodity, the additional satisfaction obtained from each successive unit gradually decreases. However, like every economic law, this principle does not apply under all circumstances. It is based on certain assumptions. If these assumptions are violated, the law may not operate in the expected manner. Let us now discuss each assumption mentioned on the slide. The first assumption is that all units of the commodity must be homogeneous. This means that every unit consumed should be identical in size, quality, color, design, and other characteristics. For example, if we are discussing cups of tea, each cup should contain the same quantity of tea and should have the same taste and quality. Similarly, if we are discussing chocolates, every chocolate should be identical. If the quality changes from one unit to another, the satisfaction obtained may also change because of differences in quality rather than because of the law itself. Therefore, homogeneity of units is an essential assumption. The second assumption is that there should be no significant time gap between the consumption of successive units. The slide states that there should be no time gap between consumption of the different units. Why is this important? Suppose a person drinks one glass of water today and another glass after 2 days. By the time the second glass is consumed, the person's thirst has returned. Consequently, the second glass may provide almost as much satisfaction as the first. In such a situation, the decline in marginal utility cannot be observed properly. Therefore, economists assume that the successive units are consumed continuously within a reasonable period. The third assumption is that the consumer is rational. A rational consumer always aims to maximize satisfaction from the available income. Such a consumer compares the benefits and costs of different alternatives before making purchasing decisions. A rational consumer also stops consuming a commodity once its marginal utility becomes zero or negative. If consumers continue consuming goods despite experiencing dissatisfaction, the law cannot accurately explain their behavior. Therefore, rational decision-making is assumed. The fourth assumption is that tastes, preferences, habits, and fashion remain unchanged during the period of consumption. Consumer preferences play an important role in determining satisfaction. Suppose a person initially dislikes coffee but suddenly develops a strong preference for it because of changing fashion or advertising. In that case, the marginal utility of additional cups of coffee may increase instead of decreasing. Similarly, changing lifestyles or seasonal factors may alter consumer preferences. To isolate the effect of consumption alone, economists assume that tastes remain constant. The fifth assumption is that consumers possess perfect knowledge of market prices. The slide mentions that consumers should have perfect knowledge of the prices prevailing in the market. This means consumers know exactly what different sellers are charging for a product. With complete information, consumers can make rational purchasing decisions. In modern markets, the internet, online shopping platforms, and price comparison websites have made this assumption more realistic than in the past. The sixth assumption is that there should be no change in the price of the commodity. If the price changes while consumption is taking place, consumer behavior may also change. For example, if the price suddenly falls, consumers may buy additional units because they have become cheaper rather than because those units provide greater utility. Similarly, a price increase may reduce consumption. Therefore, economists assume that the price remains constant while studying the law. The seventh assumption is closely related to the law itself. The slide states that it assumes the law of diminishing marginal utility. In other words, the law applies to normal goods under ordinary market conditions where additional consumption gradually reduces additional satisfaction. The eighth assumption is that the utilities of different commodities are independent of each other. This means the satisfaction obtained from one commodity should not depend upon the consumption of another commodity. For example, the utility obtained from drinking tea should not depend upon simultaneously consuming biscuits. However, in reality, many goods are complementary. Tea and biscuits, cars and petrol, or mobile phones and internet services often provide greater satisfaction when consumed together. Therefore, economists simplify the analysis by assuming independence of utilities. These assumptions may appear restrictive, but they help economists isolate the relationship between consumption and satisfaction. In the previous slide, we discussed the assumptions of the law of diminishing marginal utility. We learned that the law operates under certain conditions such as homogeneous units, rational consumer behavior, constant tastes, and stable prices. In this slide, we shall understand why this law is considered a natural law of consumer behavior by studying the three basic facts on which it is based. The slide explains that the law of diminishing marginal utility is founded upon three important facts about human behavior. These facts explain why consumers gradually experience less satisfaction from consuming additional units of the same commodity. Let us examine each of these facts carefully. The first fact is that human wants are unlimited, but each individual want can be satisfied. This is one of the most fundamental principles of economics. As human beings, our overall wants are practically unlimited. We desire better food, better clothing, better education, improved housing, entertainment, travel, healthcare, and countless other goods and services. However, while our total wants are unlimited, each individual want has a limit. For example, consider the desire to drink water. When a person is extremely thirsty, the desire for water is very intense. The first glass of water provides tremendous satisfaction because it satisfies the most urgent need. After drinking one glass, the thirst is partially satisfied. The second glass still provides satisfaction, but the intensity of the want has already decreased. By the third or fourth glass, the desire for water becomes much weaker. Eventually, the person's thirst is completely satisfied. At that stage, additional glasses of water provide little or no extra satisfaction. Therefore, although people will continue to have many other wants, the particular want for water has been satisfied. This gradual satisfaction of an individual want explains why marginal utility declines. The second fact mentioned on the slide is that different goods are not perfect substitutes for each other. What does this mean? Every commodity satisfies a particular type of want. Food satisfies hunger. Water satisfies thirst. Books satisfy the desire for knowledge. A mobile phone satisfies communication needs. Medicine satisfies health-related needs. One commodity generally cannot completely replace another. For example, if a person is thirsty, offering more bread cannot completely satisfy the desire for water. Similarly, purchasing additional shirts cannot replace the need for food. Because each commodity satisfies a specific want, consumers eventually shift their spending from one commodity to another after the first one has been sufficiently satisfied. This explains why consumers diversify their purchases instead of buying unlimited quantities of a single product. The third fact stated on the slide is that there is no change in the tastes of consumers. Consumer preferences play a very important role in determining satisfaction. If a person's likes and dislikes remain unchanged, the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming successive units naturally declines. For example, suppose a person enjoys drinking mango juice. If that preference remains constant, each additional glass of mango juice will generally provide less satisfaction than the previous one. However, if the person's tastes suddenly change, for example, because of advertising, seasonal changes, or health advice, the pattern of utility may also change. Therefore, economists assume that tastes remain stable while explaining the law. Together, these three facts explain why the law of diminishing marginal utility reflects normal human behavior. Human wants become gradually satisfied. Different goods satisfy different wants. Consumer preferences remain reasonably stable during the period of consumption. Consequently, additional satisfaction naturally declines as consumption increases. Let us consider another practical example. Imagine attending your favorite movie. Watching it for the first time may provide great excitement and enjoyment. Watching the same movie a second time may still be enjoyable, but the excitement is reduced because you already know the story. Watching it repeatedly within a short period may gradually become boring. The enjoyment obtained from each additional viewing decreases. This demonstrates the principle of diminishing marginal utility in everyday life. From a business perspective, companies understand this behavior very well. That is why businesses continuously introduce new products, improve designs, additional features, seasonal offers, and product variations. Restaurants regularly change their menus. Streaming platforms release new movies and television series. Fashion companies launch new collections every season. Smartphone manufacturers introduce upgraded models each year. In the previous slide, we discussed the three important facts that form the basis of the law of diminishing marginal utility. We learned that although human wants are unlimited, each individual want can be satisfied, different goods satisfy different wants, and consumer preferences remain unchanged during the period of consumption. In this slide, we shall understand the law through one of the most famous and practical examples used in economics, the example of a thirsty person drinking successive glasses of water. The slide begins by asking us to imagine a person who is extremely thirsty. Suppose this person has been walking for a long time on a hot summer afternoon. Naturally, his desire for water is very intense. The price of water, for the purpose of this example, is assumed to be zero. This assumption allows us to focus entirely on the satisfaction obtained from consumption without considering the influence of price. Now let us observe what happens as the person drinks successive glasses of water. The first glass of water provides enormous satisfaction. Since the person's thirst is at its highest level, the first glass satisfies the most urgent need. Therefore, the marginal utility of the first glass is very high. Economists often refer to this satisfaction as the initial utility because it represents the utility obtained from consuming the first unit of the commodity. Now the person drinks the second glass of water. Although this glass also provides satisfaction, it is less satisfying than the first one. Why? Because the person's thirst has already been partially satisfied after drinking the first glass. The urgency of the need has declined. Therefore, the additional satisfaction obtained from the second glass is smaller than that obtained from the first glass. This is exactly what the law of diminishing marginal utility predicts. Next, the person drinks the third glass of water. Again, satisfaction increases, but the increase is even smaller than before. The consumer is now approaching complete satisfaction. Each successive glass contributes progressively less additional satisfaction. Suppose the person now drinks the fourth and fifth glasses. By this stage, the thirst has been completely quenched. The marginal utility of the fifth glass becomes zero. This point is called the point of saturation or the point of consumer's equilibrium. At this stage, the consumer has achieved maximum satisfaction. Another glass of water provides no additional benefit. Now imagine that the person is forced to drink a sixth glass of water. Instead of increasing satisfaction, the extra glass creates discomfort. The person may feel heavy, uncomfortable, or even nauseous. Therefore, instead of adding to total utility, this additional glass actually reduces total utility. The marginal utility becomes negative. Economists describe this situation as disutility. The slide therefore emphasizes an important point. A rational consumer will never continue consuming a commodity after its marginal utility becomes negative, even if the commodity is available free of cost. This is because rational consumers always attempt to maximize satisfaction, not merely increase consumption. The slide also concludes that a consumer continues consuming a free good only as long as its marginal utility remains positive. Once marginal utility becomes zero, the consumer reaches complete satisfaction. Further consumption reduces overall welfare. This simple example demonstrates why consumers naturally stop consuming additional units of the same commodity after a certain point. The concept is not limited to water. Consider eating your favorite ice cream. The first scoop tastes wonderful. The second scoop is enjoyable but slightly less satisfying. The third scoop provides still less pleasure. Eventually, you may not want another scoop. If someone forces you to eat 2 or 3 more scoops, the experience may become unpleasant. Similarly, listening repeatedly to the same song, watching the same movie several times in one day, or playing the same video game continuously eventually becomes less enjoyable. In every case, the additional satisfaction obtained from successive units declines. This demonstrates that the law of diminishing marginal utility is not merely an economic theory, but a reflection of normal human behavior. From a managerial perspective, this principle has significant business implications. Since consumers eventually become satisfied with repeated consumption, firms constantly introduce new flavors, improved designs, updated technology, attractive packaging, limited editions, and innovative product features. For example, beverage companies introduce new flavors, smartphone manufacturers launch upgraded models, restaurants update their menus, and streaming platforms continuously add fresh content. These innovations help maintain consumer interest and delay the decline in marginal utility. In the previous slide, we understood the law of diminishing marginal utility through the example of a thirsty person drinking successive glasses of water. We observed that each additional glass of water provided less satisfaction than the previous one. In this slide, we shall examine the numerical illustration of the same example using the table shown on the slide. This table clearly demonstrates how total utility and marginal utility change as consumption increases. The table contains 3 columns. The first column shows the number of glasses of water consumed. The second column shows total utility, which represents the total satisfaction obtained after consuming each glass. The third column shows marginal utility, which represents the additional satisfaction obtained from each successive glass. Let us analyze the table step by step. When the thirsty person drinks the first glass of water, the total utility is 20 units. Since this is the first unit consumed, the entire satisfaction obtained from it is also the marginal utility, which is 20 units. The first glass therefore provides the highest level of satisfaction because it satisfies the most urgent need. Now the consumer drinks the second glass. The total utility increases from 20 units to 32 units. The additional satisfaction obtained from the second glass is therefore 32 minus 20 equals 12 units. Thus, the marginal utility of the second glass is 12. Notice that although total utility has increased, the additional satisfaction has declined from 20 units to 12 units. Next, the consumer drinks the third glass. The total utility rises further to 40 units. The marginal utility is calculated as 40 minus 32 equals 8 units. Again, the total utility increases, but the marginal utility continues to decline. Now let us consider the fourth glass. The total utility becomes 42 units. The additional satisfaction is 42 minus 40 equals 2 units. This shows that the consumer is approaching complete satisfaction. Although total utility is still increasing, it is increasing at a much slower rate. Now comes an important stage. After drinking the fifth glass, the total utility remains at 42 units. There is no increase in total utility. Therefore, 42 minus 42 equals 0. The marginal utility of the fifth glass is 0. This point is known as the point of satiety or the point of consumer's equilibrium. At this stage, the consumer has achieved maximum satisfaction. The thirst has been completely satisfied. Any additional consumption provides no extra satisfaction. Now suppose the consumer drinks the sixth glass. Interestingly, the total utility falls from 42 units to 39 units. Instead of increasing satisfaction, the extra glass actually reduces total satisfaction. The marginal utility becomes 39 minus 42 equals minus 3 units. Thus, the marginal utility becomes negative. This negative utility is known as disutility. The consumer now experiences discomfort because consumption has exceeded the level required to satisfy the want. The table therefore demonstrates 3 important stages in consumer satisfaction. The first stage is where marginal utility is positive. During this stage, every additional glass of water increases total utility. The consumer continues consuming because each unit provides additional satisfaction. The second stage occurs when marginal utility becomes 0. At this point, total utility reaches its maximum value. The consumer has achieved complete satisfaction. This is the ideal consumption level for a rational consumer. The third stage begins when marginal utility becomes negative. Additional consumption now creates dissatisfaction instead of satisfaction. As a result, total utility begins to decline. A rational consumer will always stop consuming before entering this stage. This numerical example beautifully confirms the law of diminishing marginal utility. The first unit provides the greatest satisfaction, and every successive unit contributes progressively smaller amounts of additional satisfaction. Eventually, the additional satisfaction disappears completely, and further consumption becomes harmful. From a managerial perspective, this table has significant practical importance. Businesses understand that consumers eventually become fully satisfied with repeated consumption of the same product. Therefore, firms continuously introduce new flavors, improved models, updated technology, attractive packaging, loyalty programs, and innovative features to maintain consumer interest. For example, soft drink companies introduce new flavors, smartphone manufacturers launch upgraded models every year, and restaurants regularly add new dishes to their menus. These innovations help increase the perceived marginal utility of their products and encourage repeat purchases. In the previous slide, we studied the numerical illustration of the law of diminishing marginal utility using the example of successive glasses of water. We observed that total utility increased initially, while marginal utility gradually declined, eventually becoming zero and then negative. In this slide, we shall understand the same concept with the help of a graph, which provides a visual representation of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Let us first understand the axis of the graph shown on the slide. The horizontal axis, or the x-axis, represents the number of units of the commodity consumed. In this example, the units represent the successive glasses of water consumed by a thirsty person. The vertical axis, or the y-axis, measures the marginal utility obtained from each glass of water. The curve shown in the graph is the marginal utility curve, labeled as mm. Notice that the curve slopes downward from left to right. This downward slope is the graphical representation of the law of diminishing marginal utility. It shows that as the consumer continues consuming additional units of the commodity, the marginal utility gradually decreases. Let us now examine the different points on the graph. The first glass of water provides the highest marginal utility, which the slide identifies as 20 units. This is called the initial utility because it is the utility obtained from consuming the very first unit of the commodity. The first glass provides maximum satisfaction because the person's thirst is at its highest level. After consuming the first glass, the consumer drinks the second glass. The marginal utility falls because part of the thirst has already been satisfied. The consumer still enjoys drinking the second glass, but the additional satisfaction is lower than before. The same pattern continues with the third and fourth glasses. Each successive glass provides less additional satisfaction than the previous one. The downward slope of the marginal utility curve clearly illustrates this continuous decline. Now observe the point where the marginal utility curve touches the horizontal axis, also known as the x-axis. The slide explains that the marginal utility of the fifth glass becomes zero. This point is called the satiety point. What is the meaning of the satiety point? It is the stage where the consumer has achieved maximum satisfaction from consuming the commodity. The particular one has been completely satisfied. At this point, consuming one additional unit provides no extra satisfaction. The consumer has reached the consumer's equilibrium with respect to that commodity. A rational consumer normally stops consuming at this stage because no additional benefit can be obtained. Now let us observe what happens beyond the satiety point. The graph shows that after the fifth glass, the marginal utility curve moves below the horizontal axis. The slide mentions that the marginal utility of the sixth glass is -3 units. This means the marginal utility has become negative. Negative marginal utility indicates disutility. Instead of increasing satisfaction, the additional unit now causes discomfort. The consumer may feel excessively full or uncomfortable because the need has already been completely satisfied. This explains why the marginal utility curve lies below the x-axis after the point of saturation. The graph therefore illustrates 3 important stages. The first stage is the positive marginal utility stage, where the curve lies above the x-axis. Here, every additional unit provides positive satisfaction, and total utility continues to increase. The second stage is the satiety point, where marginal utility becomes zero. At this stage, total utility reaches its maximum value. The third stage is the negative marginal utility stage, where the curve lies below the x-axis. Here, additional consumption reduces total utility because the consumer experiences dissatisfaction. The slide also mentions an important economic relationship. When a commodity has a price, a rational consumer continues purchasing it only until the marginal utility equals the price of the commodity. Economists express this condition as mu equals P. This means that consumers compare the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming one more unit with the price they have to pay. If the marginal utility is greater than the price, purchasing another unit increases satisfaction. If the marginal utility becomes lower than the price, purchasing another unit is not worthwhile. Therefore, A rational consumer continues consumption until marginal utility becomes equal to price. This principle forms the basis of consumer equilibrium, which we shall study in greater detail when discussing the law of equimarginal utility. From a managerial perspective, this graph provides valuable insights into consumer behavior. In the previous slide, we studied the graphical explanation of the law of diminishing marginal utility and learned that marginal utility gradually declines as consumption increases. We also observed that a rational consumer continues consuming a commodity only until its marginal utility equals its price. Although the law of diminishing marginal utility is one of the most fundamental principles of economics, it is not without limitations. Like every economic law, it has certain exceptions and practical difficulties. This slide discusses those important limitations. The first limitation mentioned on the slide is the case of intoxicants. The law assumes that additional units of a commodity provide progressively less satisfaction. However, in the case of intoxicating substances such as alcohol, cigarettes, or certain addictive drugs, the opposite may appear to happen for a short period. A person consuming alcohol may initially experience increasing enjoyment and may even develop a stronger desire for additional drinks. Instead of marginal utility declining immediately, it may temporarily increase because of addiction or psychological dependence. However, this situation does not invalidate the law completely. It simply represents an exceptional case where addiction influences consumer behavior. Over a longer period, even intoxicants eventually follow the principle of diminishing satisfaction because excessive consumption leads to discomfort, illness, or harmful consequences. The second limitation concerns the application of the law to money. The slide points out that although the law is often said to apply to money, many people believe that the more money a person has, the more he desires additional money. At first glance, this appears to contradict the law of diminishing marginal utility. However, economists explain that money itself is not consumed directly. Instead, money is a medium through which consumers purchase goods and services. Because money can satisfy numerous different wants, its marginal utility behaves differently from ordinary commodities. Therefore, applying the law directly to money becomes difficult. The third limitation relates to rare collections. The slide gives the example of diamonds, rare stamps, and rare coins. Collectors often derive greater satisfaction from acquiring additional rare items. For example, if there are only 2 rare diamonds in the entire world, a collector who already owns 1 diamond may derive even greater satisfaction from acquiring the second because the complete collection becomes more valuable. Similarly, stamp collectors and coin collectors often experience increasing satisfaction as their collections become more complete. Such situations appear to violate the law of diminishing marginal utility because the additional unit may provide greater rather than smaller satisfaction. However, these are exceptional situations involving unique or scarce collectibles rather than ordinary consumer goods. The fourth limitation is that utility is subjective. Different individuals derive different levels of satisfaction from the same commodity. For example, a cup of coffee may provide tremendous satisfaction to one person, but almost no satisfaction to someone who dislikes coffee. Similarly, a cricket match may be highly enjoyable for a sports enthusiast, but less interesting for someone who has no interest in sports. Since satisfaction differs from person to person, it becomes difficult to measure utility objectively. This subjectivity limits the practical application of the law. The fifth limitation is that cardinal measurement of utility is not possible. Early economists assumed that utility could be measured in imaginary units called utils. Modern economists, however, argue that satisfaction is a psychological experience. Unlike weight, length, or temperature, utility cannot be measured precisely using any instrument. We can compare satisfaction only in relative terms rather than assigning exact numerical values. Therefore, the assumption of measurable utility is considered unrealistic. The sixth limitation states that every commodity is not independent. In real life, many goods are either complementary or substitute goods. For example, tea is often consumed with biscuits. Cars require petrol. Mobile phones require internet services. The utility obtained from one commodity frequently depends upon the availability of another. This interdependence makes it difficult to analyze the utility of each commodity separately. The seventh limitation is that marginal utility cannot be estimated accurately for all commodities. Certain services such as education, healthcare, insurance, legal advice, or public services provide benefits over long periods. The satisfaction obtained from these services cannot easily be measured after consuming each unit. Therefore, estimating marginal utility becomes practically difficult. In the previous slide, we understood the law of diminishing marginal utility with the help of a numerical table showing the utility obtained from successive glasses of water. We observed that the total utility increased initially, while the marginal utility continuously declined. In this slide, we shall understand the same concept through a graphical representation, which provides a clearer picture of how marginal utility behaves as consumption increases. Let us first examine the graph shown on the slide. The horizontal axis, or the x-axis, measures the units of the commodity consumed. In this example, each unit represents a successive glass of water consumed by a thirsty person. The vertical axis, or the y-axis, measures the marginal utility, that is, the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming each extra unit of the commodity. The curve shown on the graph is called the marginal utility curve, represented by mm. Immediately, we notice that the marginal utility curve slopes downward from left to right. This downward slope is the graphical representation of the law of diminishing marginal utility. It indicates that as the consumer consumes more and more units of the same commodity, the additional satisfaction obtained from each successive unit gradually decreases. Now let us understand the different points shown on the graph. When the consumer drinks the first glass of water, the marginal utility is 20 units. This is the highest marginal utility because the consumer is extremely thirsty. The first glass satisfies the most urgent need and therefore provides maximum satisfaction. The slide refers to this as the initial utility. As the consumer drinks the second glass, the thirst has already been partially satisfied. Therefore, the second glass still provides satisfaction, but less than the first. Similarly, the third glass provides less additional satisfaction than the second, and the fourth glass provides even less. This gradual decline in additional satisfaction is shown by the downward movement of the marginal utility curve. Notice that although marginal utility is falling, it remains positive during this stage. This means that each additional glass still increases the consumer's total utility. As long as marginal utility remains positive, the consumer has a reason to continue consuming the commodity. Now observe the point where the marginal utility curve touches the horizontal axis. According to the graph, this occurs at the fifth glass of water. At this point, the marginal utility becomes zero. The slide identifies this as the satiety point. The word satiety means complete satisfaction. By the time the consumer reaches the fifth glass, the thirst has been completely quenched. The consumer has obtained the maximum possible satisfaction from drinking water. Another glass provides no additional satisfaction. Therefore, the marginal utility is exactly zero. It is important to understand that this does not mean the consumer is dissatisfied. Rather, it means that the consumer has reached maximum satisfaction. Economists also describe this stage as the consumer's equilibrium with respect to that commodity, because consuming another unit provides no additional benefit. The graph therefore illustrates an important relationship. As long as the marginal utility curve remains above the horizontal axis, marginal utility is positive. Positive marginal utility means that every additional unit contributes positively to total utility. The closer the curve moves towards the horizontal axis, the smaller the additional satisfaction becomes. Eventually, the consumer reaches the point where the additional satisfaction completely disappears. This graph confirms exactly what we observed in the numerical table. The first unit provides the greatest satisfaction. Each successive unit provides progressively smaller additional satisfaction. The fifth unit provides zero additional satisfaction. Thus, the graphical analysis perfectly supports the law of diminishing marginal utility. From a managerial perspective, this graph explains why firms cannot expect consumers to continue purchasing unlimited quantities of the same product. As consumer satisfaction gradually declines, demand for additional units also begins to weaken. Businesses therefore introduce product improvements, attractive packaging, new flavors, updated models, and innovative features to increase the perceived marginal utility of their products and encourage repeat purchases. In summary, the graph demonstrates that the marginal utility curve slopes downward because each successive unit of a commodity provides less additional satisfaction than the previous one. The first unit gives the highest initial utility, while the fifth unit reaches the satiety point where marginal utility becomes zero. As long as marginal utility remains positive, total utility continues to increase, confirming the fundamental principle of the law. In the previous slide, we analyzed the first part of the graph illustrating the law of diminishing marginal utility. We learned that the marginal utility curve slopes downward and eventually reaches the satiety point, where marginal utility becomes zero. In this slide, we shall complete the interpretation of the graph by understanding what happens after the point of saturation and how this graph explains consumer equilibrium. Let us continue from the satiety point shown on the graph. The fifth glass of water represents the stage where the consumer has completely satisfied the particular want. At this point, the marginal utility is zero. Now suppose the consumer is forced to drink a sixth glass of water. Observe the graph carefully. The marginal utility curve now moves below the horizontal axis, or the x-axis. The slide mentions that the marginal utility of the sixth glass is -3 units. A negative marginal utility indicates that instead of increasing satisfaction, the additional unit now creates dissatisfaction, also known as disutility. Why does this happen? The answer is simple. The consumer has already satisfied the need for water. Further consumption is unnecessary. Instead of producing pleasure, excessive consumption causes discomfort. The person may feel heavy, uncomfortable, or even sick. Consequently, total utility begins to decline. This explains why the marginal utility curve lies below the horizontal axis after the satiety point. The graph therefore illustrates three distinct stages of consumption. The first stage is the positive marginal utility stage. Here, the marginal utility curve lies above the x-axis. Each additional unit provides positive satisfaction, encouraging the consumer to continue consuming. The second stage is the point of satiety, where marginal utility becomes zero. This is the point of maximum total utility. The consumer has achieved complete satisfaction. The third stage is the negative marginal utility stage, where the marginal utility curve lies below the x-axis. Additional consumption reduces total utility because the consumer experiences dissatisfaction. A rational consumer, therefore, never continues consumption into this stage voluntarily. The slide concludes with a very important economic principle. When a commodity has a price, the consumer will continue consuming it only until marginal utility becomes equal to its price. Economists express this relationship as mu equals P. Let us understand what this means. Suppose the price of one glass of water is 20 Indian rupees. If the marginal utility obtained from another glass is worth more than 20 Indian rupees, purchasing that glass increases the consumer's overall satisfaction. However, as consumption continues, marginal utility declines. Eventually, marginal utility becomes exactly equal to the price. At this point, the consumer has no incentive either to increase or decrease consumption. This is known as the consumer's equilibrium. If marginal utility falls below the price, purchasing another unit would reduce the consumer's overall welfare because the additional satisfaction would be less than the amount paid. Therefore, a rational consumer stops purchasing at the point where marginal utility equals price. This principle forms the foundation of modern consumer choice theory. Businesses also make extensive use of this concept. Companies attempt to increase the marginal utility of their products through innovation, improved quality, branding, advertising, warranties, after-sales service, and attractive packaging. By increasing perceived marginal utility, firms encourage consumers to continue purchasing even at existing prices. Similarly, governments use this concept while studying taxation, subsidies, consumer welfare, and public pricing policies. Thus, this simple graph has enormous practical significance in economics, marketing, and business management. In summary, the second part of the graph shows that after the satiety point, marginal utility becomes negative because additional consumption creates disutility. The graph also explains consumer equilibrium through the condition mu equals price, according to which a rational consumer continues consuming a commodity until the additional satisfaction obtained from the last unit exactly equals the price paid for it. This graphical analysis provides a complete understanding of the law of diminishing marginal utility and its practical applications in consumer behavior and managerial decision-making. In the previous slide, we studied the graphical explanation of the law of diminishing marginal utility and observed how marginal utility declines with successive units of consumption, eventually becoming zero and then negative. We also learned that the law successfully explains the behavior of consumers under normal conditions. However, like every economic principle, this law is not universal. It has certain limitations and exceptions. These limitations do not invalidate the law, but they indicate situations where it cannot fully explain consumer behavior. The first limitation mentioned on the slide is the case of intoxicants. The slide states that the consumption of liquor appears to defy the law for a short period because the more a person drinks, the more he likes it. At first glance, this seems to contradict the law of diminishing marginal utility. Normally, each additional unit of a commodity provides less satisfaction than the previous one. However, in the case of addictive substances such as alcohol, cigarettes, narcotic drugs, or certain stimulants, the consumer may initially experience increasing pleasure because addiction gradually develops. As addiction increases, the consumer may desire larger quantities instead of reducing consumption. However, this situation is only temporary. Over a longer period, excessive consumption causes physical discomfort, health problems, and psychological harm. Eventually, even intoxicants follow the principle that excessive consumption reduces overall satisfaction. Therefore, addiction is considered an exception rather than a contradiction of the law. The second limitation concerns the application of the law to money. The slide points out that the more money a person has, the more greedy he may become. This observation appears to suggest that the marginal utility of money does not diminish. However, economists explain that money itself is not directly consumed. Money is simply a medium of exchange that enables consumers to purchase many different goods and services. Since money can satisfy an unlimited variety of wants, its utility behaves differently from that of ordinary commodities. Therefore, the law of diminishing marginal utility cannot be applied to money in exactly the same way as it is applied to food, clothing, or other consumer goods. The third limitation relates to rare collections. The slide gives examples such as diamonds, rare stamps, and rare coins. Collectors often derive increasing satisfaction as their collections become more complete. Imagine a collector who already owns one extremely rare stamp. Acquiring the second rare stamp may provide even greater satisfaction because the collection becomes more valuable and prestigious. Similarly, if there are only 2 rare diamonds in the world, possessing the second diamond may provide greater satisfaction than possessing the first. Such situations appear to violate the law of diminishing marginal utility because the additional unit provides greater rather than smaller satisfaction. However, these are highly exceptional cases involving scarce collectibles rather than ordinary consumer goods. The fourth limitation is that utility is subjective. The slide simply states utility is subjective. This means that satisfaction varies from one individual to another. The same commodity may provide different levels of satisfaction to different people. For example, a cricket match may provide tremendous enjoyment to a cricket enthusiast but little satisfaction to someone who has no interest in sports. Similarly, coffee may be highly satisfying to one person and unpleasant to another. Since utility depends upon individual preferences, experiences, and tastes, it cannot be measured objectively. This subjectivity limits the practical application of the law. The fifth limitation states that cardinal measurement of utility is not possible. Early economists believed that utility could be measured numerically in imaginary units called utils. Modern economists reject this assumption. Satisfaction is a psychological feeling. Unlike weight, distance, or temperature, it cannot be measured using any scientific instrument. Consumers may compare different levels of satisfaction, but assigning exact numerical values is not practically possible. Therefore, the assumption that utility can be measured precisely is considered unrealistic. The sixth limitation is that every commodity is not an independent commodity. In reality, many goods are either complementary goods or substitute goods. For example, tea is often consumed with biscuits. Cars require petrol. Mobile phones require internet services. The satisfaction obtained from one commodity frequently depends upon the availability of another. Therefore, the utility of different commodities cannot always be analyzed independently, as assumed by the law. We have now completed this unit on utility theory and the law of diminishing marginal utility. Before concluding this lecture, let us take a few moments to reflect on the important concepts we have learned and understand how they apply to our daily lives as consumers and future business professionals. One of the biggest lessons from this unit is that every consumer attempts to maximize satisfaction from limited resources. Every day, whether we purchase food, clothing, books, electronic gadgets, or entertainment services, we make choices based on the satisfaction we expect to receive. Economics helps us understand these choices in a logical and scientific manner. We learned that utility refers to the satisfaction obtained from consuming goods and services. This satisfaction cannot be seen or touched, but it plays a crucial role in influencing consumer decisions. Different individuals may derive different levels of satisfaction from the same commodity because utility is personal and subjective. We also studied the difference between total utility and marginal utility. Total utility measures the overall satisfaction obtained from consuming all units of a commodity, whereas marginal utility measures the additional satisfaction obtained from consuming one more unit. A very important conclusion of this unit is that marginal utility gradually declines as consumption increases. This is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. Think about your own experiences. The first slice of pizza when you are hungry tastes extremely satisfying. The second slice is still enjoyable, but slightly less satisfying. The third slice provides even less pleasure. Eventually, you no longer wish to eat another slice. If someone insists that you continue eating, you may actually feel uncomfortable. This simple example demonstrates that the law of diminishing marginal utility is not merely an economic theory. It is a natural part of everyday human behavior. We also learned that this law operates under certain assumptions such as homogeneous units, rational consumer behavior, constant tastes, and stable prices. While these assumptions simplify economic analysis, they also remind us that economic theories are based on carefully defined conditions. Another important point discussed in this unit was that the law has certain limitations. It does not perfectly explain situations involving addictive products, rare collectibles, giffen goods, or goods whose utility depends on other commodities. Nevertheless, for most ordinary goods consumed in everyday life, the law provides an accurate explanation of consumer behavior. From a business perspective, utility theory has tremendous practical importance. Companies continuously introduce new products, improved features, better packaging, and innovative technology because they know that consumers eventually become satisfied with existing products. Businesses therefore strive to create additional value and increase the perceived utility of their products. Similarly, governments use consumer behavior theories while designing taxation policies, subsidy programs, consumer welfare schemes, and public distribution systems. Thus, utility theory influences not only individual decisions, but also business strategy and public policy. As students of economics and management, you should now be able to answer several important questions. What is utility? How do total utility and marginal utility differ? Why does marginal utility diminish? What is the point of saturation? Why does a rational consumer stop consuming when marginal utility becomes negative? What are the assumptions and limitations of the law of diminishing marginal utility? If you can confidently answer these questions, you have understood the core ideas of this unit. As you continue your study of microeconomics, you will discover that utility theory forms the foundation for many advanced concepts such as consumer equilibrium, the law of equimarginal utility, indifference curve analysis, and modern theories of consumer choice. Therefore, mastering the concepts covered in this unit will make the upcoming topics much easier to understand. I encourage you to revise the numerical examples, graphs, assumptions, and limitations discussed throughout this lecture. Try to relate these concepts to your own purchasing decisions and observe how the law of diminishing marginal utility operates in everyday life. Thank you for your active participation throughout this lecture. I hope this discussion has helped you develop a clear understanding of utility theory and its significance in economics and business decision-making. Thank you once again, and I look forward to meeting you in the next unit.